6 silver coins for a dying woman, the auctioneer bawled, and neither one knew that bargain would save them both before the first snow fell. It happened on a dusty street in Cedar Hollow, in front of a crowd that laughed at the sale, at the buyer, and at the whole sorry business of it, never once guessing that the broken one-legged stranger paying those coins would walk away from that auction block the same man who had walked toward it, only to become someone else entirely before winter let them go. Cedar Hollow, Colorado Territory, October 1877. The wind that morning carried alkali dust and horse sweat, and underneath it the sour ghost of last night's whiskey still leaking out of Silas Walker's skin. He sat on an overturned crate outside the mercantile, watching the crowd gather at the auction platform with the flat, used-up interest of a man who had stopped expecting anything from a day in 3 years. His left leg throbbed the way it always did when weather was coming, and the gray clouds stacking over the peaks to the west promised the season's first hard frost by nightfall. Grapeshot had torn the leg apart on some nameless ridge in Georgia in the last brutal year of the war, and a field surgeon, who was either drunk or past caring, had sewn what was left of it back together. He had walked on anger and rot-gut whiskey ever since, in roughly that order, and most days that was enough to get him from sunup to dark. Cedar Hollow had long since stopped expecting much from him either. He'd come back from the war to find the ranch his father left him mortgaged twice over, and half the cattle run off or sold by a foreman who figured a one-legged man wasn't coming home to argue about it. Thus, he'd clawed back a little land, a little stock, a 2-room cabin he'd built himself with a hammer in one hand and a bottle within easy reach of the other, and that was the whole of what he had to show for 40 years on earth. Men in town spoke to him when they had to, and looked past him the rest of the time, the way folks look past a fence post that's been standing crooked so long nobody remembers it was ever meant to stand straight. He had made his peace with that, or told himself he had, which by then amounted to roughly the same thing. "Lot 12, called the auctioneer, a rail-thin man named Dobbs, with tobacco stains threading through his gray beard, and he gestured at the platform like he was presenting a mule. Apache woman, no more than 19, if that. Taken up during the campaigns along the Cimarron, been through 4 owners already, and not one of them could make her work right. But she's still breathing, gentlemen, and these days that's more than you can say for most stock at this price." Laughter rolled through the crowd. Miners, ranch hands, a scatter of townsmen killing a Saturday. Silas found himself looking anyway. The woman on the platform wasn't so much standing as propping herself against the post behind her, her weight canted hard onto one side. Dark hair hung in matted ropes around a face gone the color of old saddle leather from fever and sun. Her calico dress, some mission charity no doubt, was torn at the shoulder and crusted with dried mud along the hem. It was her left foot that caught and held his eye. Even 30 feet off he could see the swelling, the angry red lines climbing up out of her ankle toward the calf. Blood poisoning, and bad. A week, he thought. Maybe 2 if she was tough as rawhide. Which, looking at the set of her jaw even now, even half-conscious with fever, she plainly was. "Do I hear $3? Dobbs spat a brown stream over the platform edge. "Come on, boys. $3 for a working woman. She ain't gonna be working much with that foot rotting off her," someone hollered, and the crowd laughed again. Uglier this time. The woman's eyes were half shut, her breath coming shallow and fast, fever running high. Silas told himself to walk away. He had $19 to his name and owed 14 of it to 3 different men in this town, and winter was coming on hard and early. The sensible thing was to spend what he had on ammunition and a side of bacon and wait out the cold in his own shack, alone, the way he'd waited out every winter since he came home from the war with half a leg and no particular reason to keep living the rest of it. Instead, he heard his own voice, rusty from disuse, say $6. The street went dead quiet for the space of one heartbeat, and then it broke apart, laughing. Someone whistled. Someone else slapped him hard enough on the back to nearly put him on the ground. "Well, I will be damned," Dobbs said, grinning wide enough to show brown teeth. "Silas Walker's gone and got himself a bride, boys. Maybe old one leg ain't as dead as we figured." "Bet he's dead from the waist down, anyhow," a voice called, and another answered. "Why else would a man buy something that can't outrun him?" Silas had gotten good at not hearing things like that a long time ago. He counted his coins twice with a hand that would not quite hold still, shoved them across the pine plank to Dobbs, and climbed the 3 steps to the platform on a leg that screamed the whole way up. Up close, she looked worse, not better. Beaver had her shaking despite the day's heat, her lips cracked and beaded with blood at the corners. That foot was going to kill her before sundown tomorrow, if nobody did anything about it tonight. He cut the rawhide binding her wrists with his belt knife, and her eyes opened, found his face, and held there with an expression he could not read at all. Not gratitude, not quite fear either. Something more like measurement, a woman deciding with what strength she had left exactly how dangerous he was. "Can you walk?" he asked her. She said nothing. Didn't trust the language, maybe, or didn't have it. Fair enough. He got an arm under hers, and she was burning up under his hand, and he half carried, half dragged her down off the platform, while behind them, Dobbs moved briskly along to Lot 13, a pair of mules that were drawing better bids than she had. His horse, a rangy buckskin gelding, called Abel, stood hipshot at the rail. Silas looked at the horse, at the saddle, and back at the woman, and understood there was no way on God's earth she was going to sit a saddle upright for the 9 miles home, and no way his leg would hold both of them if he tried to keep her that way himself. "Sorry," he muttered, and lifted her across the horse's withers face down like a sack of feed corn. She didn't make a sound, didn't fight him at all. That worried him considerably more than screaming would have. He hauled himself up behind her, every motion a negotiation with the leg, and turned Abel's head for home, while Cedar Hollow dissolved into dust behind them. The ride took the better part of 3 hours. She hung limp across the gelding's neck the whole way, shuddering every so often with fever chills, and twice Silas was certain she had stopped breathing at all and had to check for a pulse with 2 fingers pressed hard against her throat, finding it faint, but there both times. He asked himself more than once on that ride exactly what in hell he thought he was doing. He was a 40-year-old drunk with 1 working leg who lived alone in a 2-room shack and drank himself quiet every night to keep from hearing things that weren't there anymore. He had no business taking on another life when he could barely stand to carry his own. But he had made the bid. He had counted out the coins. She was his now, the same as the leg, the same as the dreams, the same as everything else about his life he had never managed to fix. He thought somewhere around the 2nd hour of his mother, gone 8 years now, who used to say a man's whole character showed up in the one moment. He didn't have time to think it through first. He hadn't thought the auction through at all. $6 had simply come out of him before his better sense could stop it, the same reflex that used to send him diving for a wounded man on a battlefield without weighing the odds of getting shot doing it. He wasn't sure that reflex had done him any favors in the years since Georgia. He wasn't sure riding home with a dying stranger slack across his horse's neck that it was doing him any favors now, either. But there was no undoing a bid once it was made, any more than there was undoing a war once it had already taken your leg, and so he rode on and let the question sit unanswered, same as most of the questions in his life these days. The sun hung low and red by the time they reached his place, a squat cabin of rough pine logs chinked with river mud, tucked in a hollow between 2 low hills, with the Rockies rising behind it like broken teeth against the sky. A lean-to shed held Abel and 1 milk cow. A chicken coop sagged against the east wall. Silas half carried her inside and set her down near the iron stove, then got a fire going and put water on to boil, while she lay there, breathing fast and shallow with her eyes shut. When he finally knelt and looked hard at that foot, it was worse even than he'd feared. The whole ankle swollen to double size, mottled purple, and an angry weeping red, the infection tracking clear up past mid-calf. She jerked awake with a gasp the instant his fingers touched the skin. "I've got to clean this out," he told her, and repeated it slower, when she only stared, feeling foolish, gesturing at his own leg like a man playing charades. She answered him in Apache, sharp and clipped, and whatever it meant, it did not sound like gratitude. He fetched his last bottle of whiskey off the shelf, God help him, his very last, along with a clean rag, and told her plainly, "This is going to hurt like the devil, but you're dead by Sunday if I don't." He didn't wait for permission. He pulled the cork with his teeth, took hold of her ankle, and poured. She came up off the floor with a scream like something caught in a trap, biting him with a strength that startled him half out of his boots, cursing at him in Apache and broken English, and something that might have been Spanish, while the whiskey foamed white in the wound. He held on and kept pouring until the bottle ran dry, and when he finally let her go, she scrambled backward until her spine hit the wall, chest heaving, eyes wild as a cornered animal's. "Done," he said quiet, his own hands shaking now. "That's done." He tossed her a blanket, which he caught one-handed, without ever taking her eyes off him. He retreated to his own corner of the cabin, pulled off his boots, and lay down on the rope bed with his leg burning like a brand, and the grim knowledge that he had spent his last whiskey on a woman who looked like she'd sooner kill him than thank him. The nightmares came for him that night, the way they always did, smoke and screaming, and a boy in gray clutching his own open belly in the mud, and he woke once to find her watching him from beneath the table, a broken shard of pottery gripped tight in her fist, sharp edge turned outward. He almost laughed. He didn't. He rolled over and watched the ceiling beams until first light instead. 3 days passed that way, wary and silent, two strangers circling each other in a 2-room cabin. He woke to find her at the water bucket, eyes clear now and hard as flint, and he had half expected some word of thanks, or at least an acknowledgment that he existed. What he got instead was silence and a stare that could have frozen creek water in July. Fine by him. He had never had much talent for conversation anyway. She watched him the way a person watches weather they don't yet trust, from the corner, from behind whatever was nearest to hand, never quite turning her back to him if she could help it. He noticed she ate only after he did, and only what she'd seen him eat first from the same pot, and he understood well enough what that meant without either of them saying a word about it. He started leaving the coffee pot where she could reach it herself instead of pouring for her, and the second morning she took a cup without being told to, which he counted, privately, as a kind of progress neither of them would have named out loud. Whatever 4 owners had meant, and whatever the campaigns along the Cimarron had cost her before that, she carried it the way she carried everything. Folded down small and out of sight, never asked for pity and never once offered any of her own story up for it. Silas had seen enough broken men come home from a war to recognize the particular economy of someone rationing their own grief, doling it out only where it couldn't be used against them. He didn't ask, she didn't offer. It was, in its own strange way, the first thing they had in common. If stories like this keep you coming back, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name. On the 4th morning he woke to find her gone entirely, and for one long cold minute his stomach dropped clean through the floor, run off or worse, dead somewhere out past the tree line. Then he heard noise from the lean-to, leather creaking, Abel stamping and blowing the way he did when something had his attention. Silas got outside faster than his leg wanted to allow, nearly went down over a rock in his haste, and found her standing at the gelding's head, with her fingers working the bridle apart with quick, deliberate focus. "Hey!" He came up short, breathing hard. "What in hell do you think you're doing?" "That's good tack. Cost me $5. She spared him one flat measuring look and went right on unbuckling the cheek pieces, sliding the bit, good steel with copper rollers, bought special in Denver, free of Abel's mouth and letting it fall in the dirt like garbage. Then she loosed a string of sharp Apache at him, pointing first at the discarded bit, then at the horse's mouth, her tone leaving no doubt what she thought of the arrangement. Abel stood through the whole business with his ears loose and easy, nothing at all like the fight he usually put up under Silas's own hand on the reins. She held up one finger, disappeared into the shed, and returned with a coil of old rope he'd been saving for fence repair. Silas watched, his temper building like a kettle coming to boil, as she tested the rope's strength between her fists, then tied off a simple loop at one end and slipped it around Abel's jaw just behind where the bit had sat. Her hands moved fast, now working a knot he had never once seen before, doubled loops folding back on themselves like the rope, was water finding its own shape. Then with no saddle, no stirrup, nothing but a fistful of mane, she swung up onto the gelding's bare back in one clean motion, and settled there like she had been born to it. "That won't hold," Silas said. "A horse needs a proper bit, or he'll—" She wasn't listening. A flick of two fingers against the rope, and Abel spun left sharp enough to make Silas take a step back. Another flick, and the horse backed 4 precise steps. She leaned forward, the barest pressure of her calves, and Abel eased into a trot, smooth as poured water. She rode him in a tight figure, ate around the yard one-handed, her other hand resting easy on her thigh, her balance never once in question, tight turns, sudden stops, a dead straight backup. A few sideways steps that Silas had never seen a horse manage under any rider he'd known. Abel's ears stayed forward the whole time, easy, listening, not fighting her the way he fought Silas, every single ride. She brought the gelding to a stop directly in front of him and slid down as easily as she'd mounted. Then she pointed at the rope bridle at his right shoulder, the one that ached every ride from sawing at Abel's stubborn mouth, and mimed riding one-handed, her free hand lifted as though it held something. A rifle, he understood with a jolt. Free to shoot, free to rope a calf, free to do anything at all except fight his own horse for every turn. "Show me again," he said, quieter now, the knot. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one. She showed him 3 times, slow, guiding his clumsy hands through the loop and the twist and the doubled lock until he had it right. When he finally managed it clean, she nodded once, walked the discarded bit to the fence, and hung it there with the air of a woman closing a door for good. $5, wasted, except it wasn't wasted at all, was it? His shoulder already felt easier just thinking about never having to muscle that horse around again. In the days after the war bridle, Silas caught himself practicing the knot on scraps of rope in the evenings, working it loose and tying it again by lantern light, until his fingers stopped fumbling the doubled loop. She watched him do it once from across the room and said nothing, but the next morning she left a longer length of good cord folded on the table near his boots, and he understood it for what it was, not quite a kindness, not quite anything he had a word for, but a woman deciding a man might be worth teaching a second skill after the first one took. By the second week, they had settled into a rhythm neither one of them had asked for out loud. She still would not speak English, or would not admit to it, and they got by on pointing and nodding and a rough shorthand of gestures that somehow worked well enough. The ankle healed slow but steady, the angry red fading first to pink and then to pale scar tissue that pulled tight when she flexed her foot. She still favored it, but only when she thought he wasn't watching. Food had gotten scarce. Silas had been living on beans and the odd rabbit since late summer, careful with his 4 remaining bullets, unwilling to waste one on anything smaller than a deer, and the deer, this close to winter, had gone smart and scarce and ghost-like, gone before a man could draw a bead. He woke one morning to find her gone again, and this time he didn't panic, just sat with his chicory coffee and watched the tree line the way he'd learned to. She came back at noon, moving quiet through the scrub oak, like smoke through branches, mud to the elbows, and smelling sharp of sage. There was a look of concentration on her face. He was starting to know, the look of a woman working a problem loose in her own head. Without a word, she gathered straight branches from the woodpile, testing each for spring and strength, keeping some and tossing the rest. She collected flat stones from the creek bed. Not just any stones, he noticed, but particular ones, particular weights. She used the last of the spare rope and strips of rawhide he'd meant to fix tack with, and spent the whole afternoon building something at the edge of the clearing, while Silas watched from the doorway, curious, despite himself. The first contraption looked like a miniature gallows, 2 uprights and a crossbar balanced on nothing at all, with a flat stone the size of a dinner plate set precarious on top. The second was simpler. She stripped long fibers from a yucca plant, which he had not known was possible, twisted them into a thin, strong cord, and staked a running noose low across a game trail he had never once noticed threading through the grass. When she finished, she caught his eye and made one simple gesture. Wait, he could do that. The next morning, she checked her traps before first light. The deadfall had taken a fat ground squirrel clean through the skull without ruining meat or pelt. She reset the trigger stick with a fraction-inch adjustment and moved on to the snare, which held a jackrabbit already stiffening in the cold. She brought both back and worked at the outdoor table, with hands that wasted no motion at all, the way his own mother had worked in the lean years before the war, when making one chicken stretch 3 days was simply the shape of staying alive. The squirrel pelt came off in a single piece, turned inside out like a sock. The rabbit she worked more carefully, saving the sinew from the hind legs, setting the soft belly fur apart from the coarser hide. That night they had real meat for the first time in longer than Silas cared to admit, roasted over the fire until the fat sizzled and dripped, the cabin filling with a smell that put water in his mouth before the meat was even off the spit. She had rubbed it with sage and some other herb he didn't know, and it tasted better than anything he could remember eating in years, maybe since before the war, certainly since before he'd started drinking his supper instead of chewing it. He made real coffee that night, not the chicory he usually settled for, and poured it into the good cup, the one without a crack running through the handle, and set it in front of her. She took it without a word of thanks and drank it anyway, sitting across the table from him, and for the first time since Cedar Hollow the cabin stopped feeling quite so much like a tomb waiting to be filled. A week later, her snares and deadfalls ringed the cabin in a loose circle a quarter-mile out. Silas found them by accident checking his boundary fence, each one set with a precision that made him feel like a child watching a magic trick he couldn't follow. They ate rabbit 3 times a week, now squirrel besides, and once a raccoon that had been raiding the hen house and met its end in one of her snares. She showed him how to dress it properly, cutting away the scent glands that ruined the meat if a man didn't know to look for them. One gray afternoon she led him down to the creek that cut along the low edge of his land and showed him how to build a small weir out of stacked stone, funneling the current down to a narrow gap where a woven willow basket waited to catch whatever the water pushed through. It took the better part of a day to set right her, directing him with gestures and the occasional sharp correction when he stacked a stone wrong, and by the second morning they had 11 trout laid out gutted and gleaming on a flat rock, more fresh meat than the cabin had seen in a single haul all autumn. She smoked half of it over green willow in a makeshift rack she built from the same branches Silas had once watched her test for spring and strength, and the cabin filled for 2 straight days with a smell that made his stomach growl even after he'd eaten his fill. His shoulders stopped aching from fighting the rains. He rode one-handed now, smooth and easy, the rifle resting across his lap instead of white-knuckled in his fist. He hadn't fired a shot in weeks. The 4 bullets stayed in his coat pocket, and he found himself thinking, for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, about coat money and coffee beans, and maybe trading a stack of her pelts in town for flour and sugar come spring. He caught himself thinking in terms of maybe instead of probably not, and it startled him a little how much lighter that word sat in his chest. By then, the cabin had started to feel less like a shelter two strangers happened to share, and more like something they were building on purpose. Tanny had claimed the corner nearest the window for her own without asking, and Silas had stopped thinking of it as her corner and started thinking of it without quite meaning to, as simply where she belonged. He caught himself listening for her step on the porch boards, the way he used to listen for trouble, and found the sound settled something in his chest, rather than raising his guard the way most sounds still did. Neither of them said any of this out loud. There wasn't a language built yet in either of their mouths for saying it. The first snow came in late November. 3 days of heavy wet flakes that buried the yard in white and swallowed every sound the world usually made. Silas woke on the second morning to find her gone. Truly gone this time. No tracks anywhere near the cabin, the snow already erasing whatever sign she might have left. His first thought was that she had finally run. His second, worse thought was that he had been a fool to believe even a little that she meant to stay. He stood a long while in the doorway, looking out at nothing. Even her traps had vanished under the drifts. Abel and the cow stood huddled in the lean-to, breath steaming in air, gone hard and blue with cold. She had left nothing behind, not the moccasins, not the spare dress, not the knife he'd given her. All of it still sitting untouched in her corner of the cabin. That should have eased him. It didn't. It only made his chest go tight in a way he didn't have a name for. Maybe she hadn't planned on coming back at all. Maybe she'd simply walked out into the white and kept walking, choosing a clean death in the snow over one more day, sharing a roof with a crippled drunk who could barely look after himself, let alone anyone else. He spent that day feeding the stove more wood than it needed, and picking at beans he had no appetite for. What traps he could reach through the drifts sat empty. The animals had gone to ground smarter than most people about surviving winter. He realized somewhere in the gray middle of that afternoon how used he'd gotten to another set of footsteps in the cabin, another person's breathing in the dark, the particular rhythm of her walk favoring that once ruined ankle. The place felt hollowed out without her in it, too quiet, like the silence left behind after something got cut away. By evening he had started in on the cooking whiskey, the rough stuff he kept for when the pain in his leg went past bearing. Night came down hard and mean, the kind of cold that found every gap in the chinking and every crack in the walls, the kind that killed careless men. Frost bloomed across the inside of the windows in patterns like frozen ferns. Around 10, his leg seized entirely, the old scarred muscle locking into a spasm that doubled him over and tore a curse out of him he hadn't meant to let loose. He worked at it with his thumbs, kneading tissue gone hard as green wood, and got nowhere at all. The cold had reached down into the old wound and taken hold of it. He gave up and lay there hurting, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering if this was simply how it would end, frozen through in his own bed, alone, unmissed by anyone at all. Sometime past midnight, he heard something outside. Wind, he told himself at first, or branch giving way under the weight of snow. Then it came again, closer, unmistakably deliberate footsteps, muffled but purposeful, moving toward the cabin. He grabbed the rifle and hauled himself to the door on his good leg, alone, the bad one dragging dead behind him, his hands shaking too hard to work the latch clean the first time. Could be a drifter. Could be something worse. He hauled the door open into swirling white and howling dark, and for one endless moment saw nothing at all, and then a shape came out of the storm like something conjured from it. She had walked out of the blizzard and back into his life the same way she'd first come into it, half dead and defiant about it. Her hair hung frozen in stiff ropes, crusted white. Her lips had gone blue, her whole face the color of old bone, and she swayed on her feet as though standing up cost her every last thing she had left. But her eyes were sharp, focused, alive, and in her arms she carried something wrapped tight in a fold of cloth. He pulled her inside and slammed the door against the wind, snow cascading off her in chunks that hissed against the hot stove. "Where in hell?" He started, but she was already stumbling toward the fire, still gripping the bundle, her whole body shaking with cold so violent he could hear her teeth going. He knelt beside her, anger and relief tangled up together so tight he couldn't have said which one was winning. Her fingers, numb and clumsy with frost, worked the cloth open. Inside lay several thick roots, dark and twisted like arthritic fingers, giving off a sharp medicinal smell that cut straight through the wood smoke. She held one up for him to see, then mimed digging with both hands. He knew it from talk, overheard in Denver saloons years back. Osha root, bear root, the medicine that grew high in the roughest country, in places so hard to reach that only the desperate or the dying ever went looking for it. She had climbed into that high country in the teeth of a blizzard to bring it down for him. The thought landed in his chest like a fist. She could have died up there. Should have, by every reasonable account. The temperature at that elevation would have run 20 below, or worse, and one missed foothold on ice-slicked rock would have left her for the spring thaw to find whenever it finally came. She knelt by the stove, movements still stiff with cold, took his knife from its sheath and began scraping shavings from one root onto a tin plate, working them into a generous scoop of bacon grease until the mixture went dark and pungent, sharp with camphor and pine resin, not entirely unpleasant. Then she looked at him and gestured plainly at his leg. "It's fine," he lied, out of pure habit. She gave him a look that told him exactly what she thought of that lie. The same look, he realized with a strange ache, that his own mother used to give his father when the man claimed he wasn't tired after an 18-hour day in the fields. A look that said, plainly, "I see you, I know better, stop lying to both of us." He let her roll up his pant leg. Let her see the ruined mess underneath, the shrapnel scars running like frozen lightning through wasted muscle, the place where the field surgeon had simply given up and stitched together whatever was left. She didn't flinch, didn't so much as pause. She scooped up the warm mixture and began working it into the damaged tissue with strong, sure strokes, and the heat of it went in deep almost instantly. Not a burn, but something more like warmth, finding its way back into rooms that had stood cold and shuddered for years. His muscle began to unlock, slow and grudging, like river ice, breaking apart come spring. The spasm eased from a scream down to a whisper. She worked in silence, finding every knot, coaxing the ruined leg back toward something almost like ease. Her own hands still red and stiff with cold the whole while. When she finished, she wiped her hands on a rag, cut a thumb-sized piece from another root, and pressed it into his palm. "Chew," she told him in English, the first word she had ever spoken to him plainly. He was too startled to do anything but obey. The taste hit him like turpentine and bitter medicine both at once, and he very nearly spat it straight back out, but within seconds a warmth was spreading through his chest and out along his arms and legs like something lit from the inside. The shaking stopped. The old cold that had lived in his bones since that ridge in Georgia eased back, just a fraction, for the first time in longer than he could count. She watched him a moment, her face unreadable, and then she spoke again, slow and careful, in a language still new to her mouth. "You sleep now." "I stay." Not a question, not an offer, either. A plain statement of fact, and something else besides, something close to a promise. Silas only nodded. He didn't trust his own voice just then, didn't know what might come out of him if he tried. Gratitude, or relief, or some third thing he had no proper word for at all. She settled by the stove and pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and through the window the snow kept coming down, piling higher against the walls, and by morning the drifts would reach the eaves. They were snowed in now, cut off from the whole rest of the world, just the two of them and the cold and whatever it was that had started growing quietly between them. Not love? Not yet, and maybe not ever, not in any shape he had a name for, but something real, something that mattered, enough to matter. Winter locked the valley down hard for 2 months after that, and in all that time they barely laid eyes on another living soul. She still would not give him her name, and he still hadn't found the nerve to ask twice, and somehow it stopped feeling like it needed asking. She tended her trap lines even through the deep snow, finding game where he would have sworn none existed. He kept the fire fed, mended tack, saw to the animals. Evenings they sat on opposite sides of the stove, not talking much, but the quiet between them had gone companionable now instead of wary, safe even. His legs still ached with the weather, but she'd taught him to work the osher route himself when the pain climbed too high to bear alone. Her ankle had healed clean, nothing left of it but a faint web of scars. They were healing, both of them, in their own slow, stubborn way. Some evenings she worked hides by the stove, scraping and stretching rabbit and squirrel pelts across willow frames until the cabin walls were hung thick with them, a slow accumulation of wealth neither of them spoke about. She taught him to plait rawhide the way she'd taught him the war bridle knot, patient in the same wordless way, correcting his grip with 2 fingers when he pulled too hard and split a strand. Other nights she simply sat, with her knees drawn up, humming something low and tuneless under her breath, while she worked a bone needle through deer hide, and Silas found he had stopped minding the quiet the way he once had in fact come to listen for that particular hum the way he used to listen for trouble. He rigged a pair of crude snowshoes from bent ash and rawhide lacing, after watching her sketch the shape of them in the dirt floor with a stick, and the first time he tried them out past the lean-to and did not fall, she watched from the doorway with something that was almost unmistakably amusement. Then March brought the thaw, and with it trouble. Silas had felt the taxes coming the way. He felt weather in his bad leg, a low ache of dread he couldn't quite place, until it arrived. He'd known since February the county would want its due once the roads opened, and he'd turned the problem over more nights than he wanted to admit, lying awake doing arithmetic that never once came out in his favor, no matter how many times he ran it. $19 had bought him a stranger and a winter's worth of trouble back in October. It had not, by any stretch, bought him $53 in back taxes come spring. Silas heard the horses before he saw them, 3 riders picking a careful path up the muddy track toward the cabin. He knew the lead horse. It belonged to Emmett Cole, the land agent out of Cedar Hollow, and the other 2 were the sheriff and his deputy. Nothing good ever rode up to a man's door in a party of 3 with papers tucked under an arm. Cole swung down, first a leather folder wedged beneath his elbow. "Need a word, Walker?" "Say it from there," Silas called back, standing in the doorway with the rifle in hand, not quite aimed at anyone, and not quite not. "Now, Silas." The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Hargis, held both hands up in a show of peace. "Let's keep this civil. We're here about back taxes. Paid those in November. You paid last year's. These are this year's, plus penalty. Comes to $53. Cole drew papers from the folder and held them up like proof of something. "You've got until sundown to settle it, or we're authorized to start seizing property. $53. It might as well have been $500 or $5,000. "I don't have it," Silas said flatly. "Then we're going to have to." Cole started and stopped cold when a second figure appeared in the doorway beside Silas. She looked at the 3 riders a long moment, said nothing, and went back inside. "That the Apache woman you bought at auction?" the deputy asked, grinning under a thin mustache. "Heard tell about that." $6 for you to shut your mouth," Silas said, quiet and even, and the grin died on the young man's face fast enough. She came back out carrying a small leather pouch Silas had never once laid eyes on. She walked past him, past the porch steps, and stopped 5 feet from Cole, then tipped the pouch out over her own palm. Gold dust caught the weak spring light glittering. Better than 2 ounces of it, maybe more. "Where in hell did you?" Silas started, and she ignored him entirely, turning instead to Cole. "Enough?" she asked him plainly in careful English. Cole stared at the gold in her hand. So did Hargis. The deputy's mouth simply hung open. "That's yes, ma'am," Cole finally managed. "That's enough, and then some." She tipped the dust back into the pouch and handed it over. Cole took it like it might bite him. "We're square?" Silas asked. "You're square," Hargis confirmed, already turning his horse. "Let's move, boys." They rode off, glancing back twice, like men who couldn't quite trust what they'd just watched happen in front of them. Silas waited until they were well out of sight before he turned to her. "Where did you find that? Creek?" She pointed downstream toward the water that ran along the low end of his land. "I find, I save. How long?" "Since the snow started to melt, every day I look." She met his eyes straight on, no flinching in it at all. "This home now, I keep home." Something in his chest cracked clean open, not with pain this time, but the way river ice breaks apart come spring, all at once and without warning. "Tani," she said suddenly, and pressed a hand flat against her own chest. "My name." "Tani, Silas," he managed. "Silas Walker. If you've made it this far, become a channel member, tap join beside the channel name, and help keep this channel telling stories like it." She nodded once, like that small exchange had settled something important between them at last, then turned and went back inside, leaving him standing alone in the mud with his heart going a little too fast for a man his age. That night, a late storm rolled through, rain mixed with sleet drumming steady on the roof. Silas sat at the table working a piece of leather he'd been softening for weeks. Tani sat across from him, mending a tear in her dress with small, even stitches, the wind rattling the shutters outside while the stove threw its warmth into the room, and the coffee pot muttered on the fire. Silas finished what he'd been working on, a pair of moccasins cut from deer hide and lined soft with rabbit fur, sized against her own feet one afternoon while she was out checking traps, and never noticed him measuring. He set them on the table between them without a word. She looked at them a moment, then at him, and picked them up, turning them over to test the stitching with her thumb. "Good work," she said at last. "Put them on. They fit her perfectly." She flexed her toes inside them once, testing the give of the rabbit fur lining, and something in her face eased in a way Silas hadn't seen since the day she'd hung the Denver bit on the fence for good. She reached into the pocket of her dress and drew out something wrapped in a scrap of cloth, setting it on the table in front of him. Inside was a hunting knife fitted into a new sheath she'd worked herself from scrap leather, a simple geometric pattern burned along its length that he understood at once wasn't decoration at all, but meant something, protection maybe, or luck, or both at once. He turned it over in his hands, slow tracing the burned lines with his thumb, and thought of all the hours she must have spent on it in whatever private moments she'd carved out from a day already full of trap lines and hide scraping and keeping 2 people fed through a hard winter hours. He had never once noticed her taking. "Good work," he echoed, and the corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that he felt it land somewhere under his ribs. Outside the storm went on raging. Inside they sat together in a silence that had nothing wary left in it, drinking coffee, listening to the wind fail again and again to find its way through walls they had shored up together, plank by plank, all through that long, hard winter. There was no sweeping declaration that night, and there never would be one. No dramatic confession, no promise of a ring or a wedding day, nothing a storyteller might reach for to make the ending feel bigger than it was. There was only this 2 broken people who had found a way, slow and wary and entirely on their own terms, to fit their jagged edges together well enough to hold. 2 survivors who had learned the hard way that the strongest bonds a person can build aren't always forged in passion or sworn over in front of a preacher. Sometimes they're built one winter at a time, one storm endured together, one more ordinary evening chosen quietly over being alone. Spring came on full by late April. The aspens leafed out pale green against the dark timber above the cabin, and grass came up thick through the meadow, where Taney's trap line had run all winter. She let the snares stand empty more days than not. Now the game, plentiful enough that hunger had stopped being the thing that ruled their days. Silas's legs still ached when weather turned, same as it always would, but he had the OSHA route put by now, and he had learned, watching her work it in that first terrible blizzard night, exactly how much of the pain a person could carry when they weren't carrying it entirely alone. He rebuilt the lean-to that spring with lumber he'd finally been able to buy, trading a stack of cured pelts in Cedar Hollow the way he'd once only let himself imagine doing. Tanny planted corn and squash in a plot she cleared herself along the south wall, working the ground with the same quiet, unhurried competence she brought to everything. And some evenings Silas caught himself simply watching her from the doorway instead of doing his own chores, and didn't much care that he'd been caught at it when she glanced up and found him there. They still did not talk much, even now. Some things about each of them, the war that had taken his leg and left the rest of him hollowed out some nights, still the 4 owners and the campaigns along the Cimarron that she'd never once spoke of directly, sat too deep for words, either of them had, in either language. But the silence between them had long since stopped being the kind two strangers keep out of fear. It had become the kind that only grows between people who no longer need to fill every quiet moment with talking to know exactly where the other one stands. Cedar Hollow gossiped about them all that spring and on into summer. The drunk and the Apache woman he bought for 6 silver coins, the town said, shaking its head over the strangeness of it at the mercantile counter, and after church on Sundays. None of them ever saw what actually lived out there in that hollow between the hills. A man who had stopped drinking himself quiet every night because he no longer needed to outrun what was in his own head, and a woman who had stopped watching the door each evening because she had finally decided, on her own terms and in her own time, that this was a door worth staying behind. They had not fallen in love the way the stories tell it, fast and loud and certain. They had built something slower and in its own way harder won, 2 people who had each been sold short by the world in their own fashion, choosing each other, quietly, one ordinary day after another, because the alternative was going back to being alone, and neither one of them, not anymore, was willing to do that again. Summer brought its own steady work. Taney's corn came up tall along the south wall, and she dried strings of it in the sun, beside braided ropes of wild onion and the last of the smoked trout, building against the winter to come the way she had built against the last one. Silas traded 4 of her best cured pelts in Cedar Hollow that July for enough lumber to raise a second room onto the cabin, and if Dobbs at the mercantile counter raised an eyebrow at the order, he kept it to himself and took the coin same as anyone else's. Word got around, slow the way word does in a small territory town, that Walker's place was running cattle again, that the fence lines out past the hollow were the straightest in the county, that the man himself had stopped showing up outside the saloon of a morning with the smell of the night before still on him. Nobody quite said why out loud. Most of them had a fair idea. By the time the first snow came, again that November, a full year after Dobbs had brought his hammer down on 6 silver coins and called it a sale, nobody in Cedar Hollow spoke of Silas Walker as the town drunk anymore. He was simply Walker, who ran cattle out past the hollow with the Apache woman's help mending fence and reading sign better than any man in the territory. And if some of the old-timers still spoke of the woman he bought at auction when they thought neither one was listening, it mattered less and less with every season that passed. Tani never did explain where she'd learned to work a rope bridle, or set a snare, or find gold dust in a creek. Most men would have walked straight past. Silas never did stop wondering. He simply stopped needing the answer the way he once had, because whatever she chose to tell him, and whatever she chose to keep for herself alone, she had chosen, every single day since that first blizzard night, to stay. There had been no proposal between them, no ring, no preacher called out from town, only that same quiet choosing, renewed each morning without ceremony, which suited them both better than any vow spoken in front of witnesses ever could have. And for two people who had each spent years believing they were only good for surviving, one day at a time, that quiet, ordinary choosing turned out to be the whole of what either one of them had ever actually needed. The winter after that, one came in easy, without the hard edge of the first. The cabin held warm, the lean-to held true against the wind. And somewhere in that hollow between two low hills, under peaks that had watched over the whole slow shape of it, two people who had once been nothing but a bad joke on a dusty street in Cedar Hollow sat on opposite sides of a stove they'd both learned to keep burning, and did not need a single word between them to know exactly what they had built out of 6 silver coins and 1 broken winner and every ordinary day since.